1920 hours, September 15, 1940. Presbyterian Hospital, New York City. Dr. Charles Richard Drew stands in the laboratory examining refrigerated plasma containers. Each container holds 500 cubic centimeters of human blood plasma, the liquid component of blood without the red cells, white cells, or platelets. The plasma is amber-colored, clear and stable. Drew has stored it for 3 weeks at 4 degrees Celsius. He removes a sample and tests it. The protein content is normal. The osmotic pressure is normal. The plasma is still viable for transfusion. This is the breakthrough. Whole blood deteriorates within 7 days even under refrigeration. Red blood cells break down, and bacterial contamination increases. Transfusion with outdated whole blood can kill the recipient, but plasma separated from the cells and refrigerated remains viable for weeks or months. Plasma can be transported long distances. Plasma can be stockpiled in advance. Plasma can save lives in situations where whole blood transfusion is impossible. Drew has been developing plasma preservation techniques for 2 years. The work began as academic research, his doctoral thesis at Columbia University. Now in September 1940, the research has urgent practical application. Britain is being bombed. London hospitals are overwhelmed with casualties. Whole blood for transfusion must be collected, typed, cross-matched, and used within days. The logistics are overwhelming. Casualties arrive faster than blood can be processed. People are dying from shock and blood loss while waiting for transfusions. Drew's plasma can solve this problem. Plasma does not require typing or cross-matching. It lacks the red blood cells that carry blood-type antigens. Universal plasma can be given to any patient regardless of blood type. Plasma treats shock by maintaining blood volume and pressure. Plasma can be administered rapidly by any physician or nurse. Most critically, plasma can be collected in America, shipped to Britain, and remain viable for weeks after arrival. Drew picks up the telephone and calls Dr. John Scudder at Columbia. Scudder is coordinating with the Blood Transfusion Betterment Association to establish a program sending plasma to Britain. Drew tells Scudder the test results 3-week-old plasma is still viable. Scudder asks how much plasma can be produced per day. Drew calculates each blood donation yields approximately 250 cubic centimeters of plasma after separation and processing. A single collection center processing 100 donations per day can produce 25 liters of plasma. 10 centers can produce 250 liters per day, 30,000 liters per month, enough to supply London hospitals. Scudder asks if Drew can supervise the program. Drew accepts immediately. Within days, Drew becomes medical director of Blood for Britain, the program that will collect, process, and ship plasma to British hospitals. The program will run for 5 months from September 1940 to January 1941. It will collect 56 donations, process 5,000 liters of plasma, and ship the plasma across the Atlantic in refrigerated containers. The plasma will save thousands of British civilian and military casualties during the Blitz. But Blood for Britain is only the beginning. Drew's larger contribution will be establishing the system of blood banks that becomes standard in American medicine and military practice, a system that will save millions of lives during World War II, and that remains the foundation of transfusion medicine 80 years later. Charles Richard Drew was born June 3, 1904 in Washington, D.C. His father was a carpet layer. His mother was a teacher. The family was middle-class African-American in a rigidly segregated city. Drew attended Dunbar High School, an elite all-black school that sent most graduates to college. He excelled in academics and athletics: football, basketball, track, swimming. He won an athletics scholarship to Amherst College in Massachusetts. At Amherst, Drew encountered the contradictions of Northern racial attitudes. The college admitted black students. He was one of 13 in his class, but social segregation was informal and pervasive. Black students were not invited to fraternities. They were not welcome in some dormitories, but Drew was popular. His athletic ability and personal charisma transcended social barriers. He was elected to the track team and won multiple championships. He graduated in 1926 with a degree in biology and was selected for the college's Hall of Fame. Drew wanted to attend medical school but lacked tuition money. He worked for 2 years as a biology teacher and athletic director at Morgan College in Baltimore, saving money. He applied to medical schools. Harvard Medical School rejected him. Their annual quota of 2 black students was filled. Howard University College of Medicine in Washington accepted him. Drew enrolled in 1928. Howard was the premier medical school for black students. The faculty included distinguished African American physicians who trained students to the same standards as white medical schools. But the resources were limited. Clinical training occurred at Freedman's Hospital, Howard's affiliated facility, which served a predominantly black patient population. Opportunities for advanced training or research positions after graduation were constrained by racial barriers. Drew graduated in 1933, ranked first in his class. He completed his surgical internship at Freedman's Hospital. Then he was admitted to a residency at Presbyterian Hospital in New York, one of the few northern hospitals that accepted black residents. This was the critical opportunity. Presbyterian Hospital was affiliated with Columbia University. The hospital conducted advanced research. The surgical staff included leading specialists. Drew would have access to equipment training and research opportunities unavailable at black institutions in the South. Drew's residency supervisor was Dr. John Scudder, a vascular surgeon researching blood transfusion. Transfusion in the 1930s was primitive and dangerous. Blood types had been discovered in 1901 by Carl Landsteiner, the AB, and O classifications. Typed and cross-matched transfusions were safer than untyped transfusions, but the process was complex. Blood had to be collected immediately before transfusion. The donor and recipient had to be in adjacent rooms. The blood was transferred directly from donor's vein to recipient's vein using a cannula, or it was collected in a glass bottle containing anticoagulant and transfused immediately. Storage was impossible. Blood deteriorated within hours at room temperature and within 7 days refrigerated. The red blood cells lysed, ruptured, releasing hemoglobin that could cause kidney failure when transfused. Bacterial contamination was common. Transfusion reactions, fever chills, sometimes fatal anaphylaxis occurred frequently. Scudder was investigating whether blood components could be separated and stored independently. His hypothesis was that plasma, the liquid portion without cells, might remain stable longer than whole blood. Drew joined this research in 1938, focusing on plasma preservation for his doctoral dissertation. The technical challenge was separating plasma from cells without contamination and preserving it without deterioration. Drew developed a centrifugation method. Whole blood was collected in sterile bottles containing sodium citrate anticoagulant, then centrifuged at 3,000 revolutions per minute for 15 minutes. The red cells, being denser, settled to the bottom. The plasma remained as a clear liquid on top. The plasma was siphoned off using sterile technique, transferred to clean bottles, and refrigerated at 4 degrees Celsius. Drew tested plasma viability over time. He measured protein content, osmotic pressure, pH, and bacterial contamination at weekly intervals. He transfused the stored plasma into rabbits and measured physiological response. The results were clear. Plasma could be stored for 4 to 5 weeks without significant deterioration. After 5 weeks, protein degradation and bacterial growth increased, but 4 weeks was sufficient for practical applications. Drew published his findings in 1940. His dissertation, Banked Blood, a Study in Blood Preservation, established the scientific foundation for blood banking. The dissertation documented that plasma could be preserved, transported, and used weeks after collection. This meant that blood collection and transfusion could be separated in time and space. Blood could be collected from healthy donors at their convenience, processed into plasma, stored in blood banks, and issued to hospitals as needed. This separated the blood supply from immediate emergency requirements. Previously, hospitals dealing with mass casualties had to call for emergency donors, type and cross-match blood urgently, and perform transfusions while casualties were still arriving. The process was chaotic and often too slow. With plasma banks, hospitals could maintain stockpiles. When casualties arrived, plasma was immediately available. The military implications were obvious. Combat casualties bled. They went into shock from blood loss. Shock killed more wounded soldiers than any other treatable cause. plasma could treat shock. But battlefield conditions made whole blood transfusion impossible. No time for typing, no refrigeration for storage, no laboratory facilities for cross-matching. Plasma solved all these problems. Universal plasma required no typing. Plasma was stable at room temperature for hours. Plasma could be administered by medics in field conditions. In September 1940, when Germany began bombing British cities, the need for plasma became urgent. The Blood Transfusion Betterment Association, a private organization in New York, organized the Blood for Britain program. Drew was the obvious choice for medical director. He had developed the preservation techniques. He had written the definitive scientific study. He was completing his doctorate at Columbia. He was available. Drew accepted the position and transformed what might have been a charitable gesture into a systematic operation. He established collection centers at hospitals across New York. He trained staff in sterile collection and processing techniques. He standardized the equipment: collection bottles, centrifuges, refrigerators, shipping containers. He developed protocols for donor screening, blood collection, plasma separation, quality testing, and packaging for shipment. The operation ran from September 1940 to January 1941. Drew personally supervised the collection centers, reviewed every batch of plasma for quality, and coordinated shipping schedules. The program collected blood from 1,456 donors, mostly civilian volunteers motivated by newsreels showing London under bombardment. Each donation was processed into plasma within hours of collection. The plasma was packaged in sealed glass ampules, 250 cubic centimeters per ampule, packed in refrigerated containers and shipped by convoy to Britain. The transatlantic crossing took 10 to 14 days. German U-boats attacked convoys, sinking cargo ships. Some plasma shipments were lost, but most arrived safely. British hospitals received the plasma, tested it, and used it. The feedback was immediate. The plasma was viable and effective. British physicians reported that American plasma was saving lives. Shock casualties who would have died before whole blood could be typed and transfused were being resuscitated with plasma. The success of Blood for Britain established the model for military blood banking. In December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the American Red Cross approached Drew about establishing a national blood donor program for the U.S. military. Drew was the obvious choice. He had proven experience, scientific credentials, and administrative capability. The Red Cross offered him the position of director of the first American Red Cross blood bank. Drew accepted and began operations in February 1942. The scale was vastly larger than Blood for Britain. The Red Cross aimed to collect 1 million units of blood per year, enough to supply plasma for all American military casualties worldwide. Drew's task was to build the infrastructure, establish collection centers in every major city, recruit donors, train staff, manufacture equipment, develop logistics for shipping plasma to combat theaters in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Drew attacked the problem systematically. He established standard procedures for every step: donor recruitment, medical screening, blood collection, plasma processing, quality control, packaging, labeling, and distribution. He designed mobile collection units, buses equipped with collection chairs, refrigerators, and processing equipment that could travel to communities without fixed collection centers. He trained thousands of nurses and technicians in blood collection techniques. He coordinated with the War Department to establish plasma depots near combat zones. The program achieved industrial scale rapidly. By mid-1942, the Red Cross was collecting 30,000 units per week. By 1943, 50,000 units per week. The plasma was processed at centralized facilities, packaged in standardized kits, and shipped to military medical units worldwide. Each kit contained dried plasma. Drew had developed a dehydration process that removed water from liquid plasma, producing a powder that could be stored at room temperature indefinitely and reconstituted with sterile water before use. Dried plasma was lighter and more stable than liquid plasma, ideal for military logistics. The dried plasma kits became standard issue for military medical personnel. Each battalion, aid station, field hospital, and evacuation ship carried hundreds of kits. Medics used plasma to treat shock on the battlefield, often within minutes of injury. Surgical teams used plasma to stabilize casualties during evacuation. Hospital ships used plasma to maintain casualties during long sea voyages. The system worked. American combat casualties in World War II had a survival rate of approximately 97%, the highest survival rate in military history to that point. Plasma therapy was a major factor in this achievement. Drew's contribution was not merely scientific, the plasma preservation techniques, but organizational. He built the systems that made plasma therapy practical at industrial scale. He standardized procedures so that thousands of people in hundreds of locations could collect, process, and administer plasma safely and effectively. He established quality controls ensuring that plasma reaching combat zones was sterile, viable, and properly labeled. He coordinated logistics moving plasma from American collection centers to battlefields in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. This systems-level thinking, treating blood banking as an integrated industrial and medical process rather than an isolated laboratory technique, was Drew's major intellectual contribution. Modern blood banking remains based on the systems Drew established: centralized collection, standardized processing, quality-controlled storage, and distributed delivery to hospitals as needed. But Drew's tenure as director of the Red Cross Blood Program lasted only 4 months. In June 1942, the War Department issued a directive: blood donations from African American donors would be accepted, but the plasma would be segregated and labeled by race. African American plasma would be used only for African American casualties. White plasma would be used for white casualties. The directive reflected military racial policies. The armed forces were rigidly segregated in 1942. Black soldiers served in separate units, often restricted to non-combat roles. The military justified segregation as maintaining unit cohesion and morale. Extending segregation to blood plasma had no medical justification. Plasma has no racial characteristics. Type O plasma from any donor is identical regardless of the donor's race. But the War Department imposed segregation anyway, bowing to political pressure from Southern politicians and military officers who opposed racial mixing even in medical contexts. Drew was outraged. He had devoted 3 years to developing plasma therapy and building blood banking systems. He had proven that plasma saved lives regardless of donor or recipient race. The Red Cross program he directed collected plasma from volunteers of all races and distributed it based on medical need. Segregating plasma by race was scientifically absurd and morally offensive. Drew protested to Red Cross leadership. He argued that plasma segregation contradicted medical science and undermined the blood donation program. African Americans comprised 10% of the population. Excluding or segregating their donations reduced the blood supply. More critically, segregation implied that black blood was inferior or contaminated, a racist belief without scientific basis. The Red Cross agreed with Drew scientifically, but deferred to military policy. The Red Cross was a civilian organization operating under War Department contracts. Defying military directives would jeopardize the contracts and possibly terminate the blood program entirely. Red Cross leadership asked Drew to continue as director and implement the segregation policy. Drew refused. He resigned as a director of the Red Cross Blood Bank in April 1942 after 4 months in the position. His resignation was not publicly announced. The Red Cross and Drew agreed to describe his departure as a return to academic and surgical responsibilities. Drew did not publicly criticize the segregation policy during the war. He believed that public controversy would damage the blood donation program and reduce plasma availability for casualties. He accepted that his private protest resignation was insufficient, but that public protest would be counterproductive. The segregation policy remained in effect through the end of the war. African American donors contributed blood that was segregated, labeled by race, and used only for black casualties. The policy was scientifically unjustified, logistically burdensome, and morally indefensible. But it persisted because military leadership and political authorities maintained racial segregation as policy even when segregation contradicted medical necessity. Drew returned to Howard University and Freedman's Hospital in 1942. He was appointed professor of surgery and chief of surgery at Freedman's Hospital. He trained the next generation of African American surgeons. He performed complex surgeries. He published research on vascular surgery and trauma management. He advocated for integration of medical institutions and elimination of racial barriers in medical training and practice. Drew's post-war career was distinguished but limited by the racial constraints of the era. He was the first African-American surgeon certified by the American Board of Surgery. He was the first African-American appointed examiner by the American Board of Surgery. He was elected to the Surgical Honor Society Sigma Pi Phi. But he was not appointed to senior positions at major northern hospitals. He was not invited to present at major surgical conferences at southern institutions. His career advancement was bounded by racial barriers that his scientific achievements could not overcome. On April 1, 1950, Drew was driving to a medical conference at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He was accompanied by 3 colleagues from Howard. Near Burlington, North Carolina, Drew fell asleep at the wheel. The car veered off the road and overturned. Drew was trapped under the vehicle. His companions were injured but able to extricate themselves. Passing motorists helped lift the car. Drew was pulled free. He was bleeding heavily from leg injuries. He was in shock. Drew was taken to Alamance General Hospital in Burlington, a segregated hospital that treated white patients. There is a persistent myth that Drew was denied treatment because he was black and that he died from delayed care due to segregation. This is not accurate. Drew was treated immediately by the emergency room physician. He received plasma, the treatment he had pioneered, but his injuries were catastrophic. His right leg was nearly severed. He had lost massive amounts of blood before reaching the hospital. He died at 1:00 p.m., approximately 1 hour after the accident. The myth that Drew died because segregation denied him treatment is false, but the myth persists because it fits a tragic narrative pattern. The black physician who saved countless white soldiers through plasma therapy dies because white physicians refuse to treat him. The actual circumstances that Drew received immediate treatment, but his injuries were too severe, are less dramatically ironic, but historically accurate. Drew's death at age 45 cut short a career that had already transformed transfusion medicine. His scientific contributions, plasma preservation, plasma banking, dried plasma development, became standard practice. His organizational innovations, centralized collection, standardized processing, distributed storage, became the foundation of modern blood banking. His social advocacy, protesting plasma segregation training, black surgeons fighting medical segregation, advanced racial integration in medicine. The statistical impact of Drew's work is measurable. During World War II, the American Red Cross collected 13.3 million blood donations and processed approximately 7 million units of plasma. This plasma treated hundreds of thousands of combat casualties and thousands of civilian trauma cases. The survival rate for American combat casualties was 97%, partially attributable to plasma therapy. Post-war, the blood banking system Drew established expanded to serve civilian hospitals. By 1950, American hospitals were transfusing 1 million units of blood annually. By 2020, 15 million units annually. Every transfusion relies on systems Drew pioneered. The counterfactual question, how many additional casualties would have died without plasma therapy, is unanswerable precisely but estimable roughly. Combat mortality from shock and blood loss in World War I before plasma therapy was approximately 15%. Combat mortality in World War II with plasma therapy was approximately 3%. If the difference 12 percentage points is attributable to plasma, and if the U.S. military suffered 678,46 wounded during World War II, then plasma therapy potentially saved approximately 80,000 American military lives. Globally, including British, Soviet, and other Allied forces using plasma, the lives saved number in the hundreds of thousands. This calculation is speculative, but the order of magnitude is defensible. Plasma therapy made a measurable difference in combat survival rates. Drew's contribution was making plasma therapy operationally feasible through preservation techniques and blood banking systems. Without Drew's work, plasma therapy would have developed. Eventually, other researchers were investigating blood preservation. But Drew accelerated the development and implemented the systems. The acceleration, measured in months or years, translated into thousands of lives saved or lost. Drew's legacy extends beyond the statistics. He demonstrated that African American physicians could achieve scientific excellence and institutional leadership despite systemic racism. He trained dozens of black surgeons who became leaders in their field. He advocated for integration when segregation was legally enforced and socially accepted. His resignation from the Red Cross Blood Bank directorship, a private protest against plasma segregation, was a moral stand that cost him professionally but maintained his integrity. The moral complexity of Drew's position in 1942 is worth examining. He could have remained as director and implemented the segregation policy while privately disagreeing. This would have maintained his institutional influence and allowed him to continue developing blood banking systems. His successor, a white physician, implemented segregation without apparent moral qualms. Drew's resignation changed nothing operationally. The segregation policy remained in effect. But resignation was Drew's personal line. He would not administer a policy that contradicted medical science and insulted African American donors. Whether this decision was strategically optimal is debatable. Resignation removed Drew from a position of influence where he might have modified implementation or prepared for post-war desegregation. But the decision was morally consistent. Drew refused to participate in a racist policy even when participation would have sustained his career advancement and institutional power. This moral calculus, choosing integrity over influence, is complicated because the stakes involved other people's lives. The blood banking program continued without Drew, but would have been better managed with Drew. Combat casualties received plasma regardless of who directed the program. Drew's resignation was symbolically important, but practically insignificant in terms of immediate outcomes. Yet Drew made the decision anyway because he believed some principles could not be compromised even when compromise would serve larger goals. This reflects a broader pattern in Drew's career. He succeeded in medicine despite racial barriers but refused to accept barriers as legitimate. He trained at white institutions when possible but returned to black institutions to train the next generation. He published research proving plasma had no racial characteristics but did not publicly attack segregation during wartime. He navigated between accommodation necessary for institutional success and resistance necessary for personal integrity. The balance was precarious and personally costly. Drew was simultaneously an establishment figure professor at Howard, chief of surgery, published researcher, and an outsider challenging racial barriers. He was celebrated by white medical institutions for scientific achievements, but excluded from leadership positions those institutions controlled. He was revered by black medical professionals as a pioneer, but could not transfer his success into systemic change during his lifetime. The change came later. The military desegregated blood banks in 1948, 3 years after the war ended, 6 years after Drew's resignation. The desegregation was ordered by President Truman as part of broader military desegregation. Whether Drew's 1942 resignation influenced the 1948 decision is unknowable. Drew did not live to see full medical desegregation. He died in 1950. The Civil Rights Act prohibiting racial discrimination in public accommodations, including hospitals, was enacted in 1964, 14 years after Drew's death. Drew's scientific legacy was recognized during his lifetime. He received honorary degrees from Virginia State College and Amherst College. He was elected to the American Board of Surgery. He was recognized by surgical societies. But the full recognition of his contributions came posthumously. The Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science in Los Angeles, established in 1966, trains minority physicians and serves underserved communities. The American Red Cross issues the Charles Drew Award annually to recognize contributions to blood banking. The U.S. Postal Service issued a Charles Drew commemorative stamp in 1981. These commemorations acknowledge Drew's scientific achievements but sometimes obscure the racial context. Drew was a brilliant surgeon and researcher who would have achieved distinction in any era. But he achieved that distinction while navigating systemic racism that limited his opportunities and constrained his career. He succeeded not merely despite racism but in active opposition to it. His success demonstrated that African American physicians could meet any scientific and professional standard when given opportunity. This demonstration was itself a political act in a segregated society that denied black intellectual equality. The plasma segregation episode illustrates the absurdity of racial policies disconnected from scientific reality. Plasma is a biological substance with measurable chemical properties. Those properties are identical across humans regardless of race. The protein's minerals' osmotic characteristics all are determined by biology, not social constructions. Segregating plasma by race made no medical sense. Yet the policy persisted because racial ideology overrode scientific evidence. Drew understood this completely. His research proved plasma's biological universality. His administrative experience demonstrated that integrated blood collection was operationally superior to segregated collection. His medical ethics rejected any practice that prioritized racial ideology over patient welfare. Yet he could not change policy because policy was determined by political and military authorities who prioritized racial segregation over medical science. This conflict between scientific knowledge and political power recurs throughout history. Drew's case is particularly stark because the scientific evidence was unambiguous and the political policy was directly harmful. Segregated blood plasma reduced supply, complicated logistics, and implied racist beliefs without any medical justification. Yet the policy continued because institutional power maintained it despite contrary evidence. Drew's response was resignation, withdrawal from institutional participation in unjust policy. This response was morally coherent but strategically limited. Resignation removed Drew from influence but did not change policy. The policy changed later due to broader social forces, military desegregation, civil rights movement, accumulation of medical evidence, changing political calculations. Drew's resignation contributed to these forces as symbolic protest, but was not causally decisive. Whether Drew could have been more effective through continued participation and internal advocacy is counterfactual. Possibly continued leadership would have moderated implementation or accelerated post-war desegregation. Possibly public criticism during wartime would have generated political pressure for policy change. Possibly resignation was the only morally acceptable response regardless of strategic effectiveness. Drew chose resignation. He chose personal integrity over institutional influence. He chose to refuse participation in a racist policy, even when refusal meant abandoning a position where his expertise could save lives. This choice reflects Drew's personal moral framework. Some principles are inviolable regardless of consequences. The question of whether this framework is optimal for achieving social change is complex. Incremental reform through institutional participation can achieve concrete improvements. But institutional participation requires accepting unjust features of institutions. The balance between pragmatic reform and principled resistance depends on context, personality, and one's assessment of what is possible. Drew's assessment in 1942 was that plasma segregation was scientifically indefensible and morally unacceptable. He could not direct a program implementing this policy. This decision cost him institutional power but maintained his scientific integrity and moral standing. Whether the trade-off was worthwhile depends on whether one values symbolic moral stands or pragmatic institutional influence more highly. History suggests Drew's resignation was symbolically important. His protest, even though private, was known within medical circles. His refusal to implement segregation demonstrated that distinguished black physicians would not accommodate racist policies even for career advancement. This demonstration influenced the next generation of African American physicians and civil rights advocates. The influence was diffuse and delayed, but real. Drew's legacy is thus dual scientific and moral. Scientifically, he developed plasma preservation and blood banking systems that saved millions of lives. Morally, he refused to compromise his principles, even when compromise would have sustained his institutional influence. Both legacies are significant. Both are complicated. Both raise questions that extend beyond Drew's individual decisions to broader issues about science, policy, race, and institutional change. At 1920 hours on September 15, 1940, Drew stood in the laboratory examining 3-week-old plasma and confirming it remained viable. This moment represented scientific breakthrough proof that plasma could be preserved and stored. The breakthrough enabled blood for Britain military blood banking and the modern transfusion medicine system. But the breakthrough also revealed limits. Scientific knowledge could prove plasma was biologically universal. Scientific evidence could demonstrate that segregation was medically unjustified. But scientific knowledge and evidence were insufficient to change policy when policy was determined by racial ideology and political power. Drew spent his career navigating this gap between scientific knowledge and social policy. He achieved scientific distinction while confronting racist barriers. He built systems saving millions of lives while being excluded from institutions those systems served. He protested injustice while avoiding public controversy that might undermine his effectiveness. The navigation was partially successful. Drew's scientific contributions were recognized. His blood banking systems became standard practice. His training of black surgeons expanded medical opportunities. But the navigation was incomplete. Plasma segregation persisted despite his protest. Medical institutions remained segregated during his lifetime. Full racial integration in medicine came after his death. Whether Drew could have achieved more through different strategies is unanswerable. What is certain is that Drew achieved extraordinary scientific and institutional accomplishments despite systematic racial barriers designed to prevent such achievements. The accomplishments demonstrated that African American physicians could meet any standard when given opportunity. The demonstration itself was a form of resistance against a racist system that denied black intellectual equality. The man who created the blood plasma banks saved millions of lives through scientific innovation and organizational leadership. He also demonstrated that moral integrity sometimes requires refusing to participate in unjust systems, even when refusal means losing institutional power. Both contributions, the scientific and the moral, define Charles Drew's legacy and challenge subsequent generations to maintain the standards he established.